The moment I pushed myself out of the hatch, my suit ballooned like a runaway balloon animal. Within seconds, my fingers stiffened, my legs felt like they were encased in stone, and I realized with absolute clarity, I might not get back inside. It was supposed to be history's first spacewalk, a triumphant leap for the Soviet program, a chance to beat the Americans once again. But floating there, 20 minutes into the void, I couldn't bend my arms enough to reach my controls. My chest heaved, and every exhale fogged the inside of my visor. Earth rolled silently below me, breathtaking and merciless at the same time. "Alexei, how do you read?" Pavel's voice cracked over the radio, calm but with that edge that only a pilot's ears can catch. I forced my hand toward the switch on my chest. My glove barely brushed it. Nothing. The suit was rigid, bloated from the pressure difference. If I didn't do something, I wasn't going home, I'd be the first man to walk in space and the first to die in it. And this was only the start. When I first stepped out, the silence was almost unbearable. The capsule was small, cramped, hot, and smelled of insulation and sweat. Outside, nothing smelled of anything at all. Only my breathing echoed inside the helmet, harsh and uneven, while the earth passed slowly below in complete silence. I expected to feel free in weightlessness, but what I actually felt was clumsy, like a diver in armor who had jumped into the water without knowing how heavy the suit would feel. The lines that connected me to the capsule tugged at my waist, and every movement was awkward, slow, and difficult. I was sweating so much that drops of moisture ran down into my eyes, and I could barely wipe them away through the visor. The first task was to test the maneuvering. I had a handrail along the hatch, and I tried to push off carefully to float in front of the ship. My body spun slowly, and I saw the capsule below, small and fragile against the black backdrop. I remember thinking, Pavel is alone in there, and if something happens to me now, there is nothing he can do. The engineers on Earth had imagined this moment as a triumph, but for me it was a growing sense of tension. I tried to push back toward the hatch, but something was wrong. My arms resisted my commands, stiff and heavy. I looked down at my suit and realized it had expanded. The joints at my elbows and knees, which were supposed to bend, had swollen to the point where I could barely move them. "Pavel, the suit has inflated," I said into the microphone, my voice louder than I intended. There was a pause, only static for a moment. Then his voice came, steady but with weight in it. "Alexei, confirm, can you maneuver?" I bent my arm, or at least tried to. It moved only slightly, and the effort sent a wave of heat through my chest. "Negative. The joints are stiff. I can hardly reach the controls." Inside the capsule, Pavel was sitting strapped into his seat, listening to every breath I took. "Understood. Do not panic. Check pressure regulator." I wanted to laugh. "Do not panic." My arms were nearly locked, my legs even worse, and the only way back into the capsule was through a hatch so narrow I had crawled through it like a snake during the test runs on the ground. Now, with my suit expanded, I could not even bend enough to fit my shoulders through. I was floating outside the ship, the first man in history to step into open space, and all I could think was that I might not be able to get back inside. The radio crackled. Ground control was calling, their voices hurried but careful not to sound alarmed. "Voskhod 2, report condition of cosmonaut." Pavel answered for me, but I could hear the strain in his tone. "Suit is inflating. Mobility is low. He may not be able to re-enter without adjustment." I was breathing too hard. Every exhale came back into my helmet with a hiss, and sweat collected in drops that floated across my faceplate, blurring my view of Earth. I wiped it with the back of my hand, but the glove barely reached. I could not imagine forcing myself back through that hatch. On the ground, they would be calculating options, but there were not many. My air supply had limits. The sun would set soon, and then there would be darkness, cold, and the long wait for another sunrise. "Alexei," Pavel said again, calm but firm. "You must reduce suit pressure manually. There is no other option. That was the first moment I understood what I had to do. Reduce the pressure inside the suit meant venting oxygen. It meant deliberately letting air escape into space, hoping I would not let too much out before I could regain mobility. It was a dangerous order. The suit was designed to keep me alive by maintaining pressure, now I had to risk suffocation just to move my arms again. I hesitated, staring at the small valve. My fingers could barely reach it. My chest hurt from the effort of each breath. In that silence, I thought briefly about how absurd it was. Humanity had sent me higher than anyone had ever gone, but the thing that might kill me was a few layers of fabric and a swollen glove. "Alexei, do you hear me?" Pavel pressed again. "I hear," I replied, trying to sound steady, though my voice cracked in the microphone. The engineers on the ground joined in, their voices sharp now. "You must reduce pressure gradually. Not more than 1/10 at a time. Do not delay." I reached for the valve. The effort felt like lifting a weight, and the suit creaked as I tried to bend. My hand trembled, not from fear but from the sheer force needed to move. I turned the valve slowly, listening for the faint hiss. It came, almost invisible against the silence, a thin stream of life leaving me. Instantly I felt the suit relax a little. The joints bent more easily. My fingers could finally close into a fist. "I feel improvement," I reported. Pavel's reply was quick. "Good." Again, but carefully. I turned the valve a second time, counting in my head, watching the gauge inside the suit drop. Sweat cooled against my skin as the airflow increased. The suit softened more, and my arms finally bent at the elbows without the same resistance. I could almost feel normal movement returning. The danger, however, was still there. If I reduced too much, the blood in my body would start to boil from the vacuum. I had to balance on the line between survival and catastrophe. The voices from Earth came more measured now, almost hopeful. "Pressure is within acceptable limits. Confirm motor functions." I moved my arms, then my legs, slow but controlled. Mobility improved. Attempting to return. The hatch waited in front of me, small and rigid. I floated closer, gripping the handrail, but even with the pressure reduced, I could see how narrow the opening looked compared to my bulky frame. I realized at that moment the real test was only beginning. The hatch was in front of me, but I already knew I was too big for it. Even after venting oxygen from the suit, I was still wider than the opening. On the ground, we had rehearsed entering and exiting dozens of times, crawling through in the training chamber with technicians watching. It had been awkward, tight, but possible. Now it felt like trying to squeeze a barrel through a keyhole. The lines connecting me to the capsule tugged at my waist, pulling me closer, but I had to force every movement as if I were dragging myself through a narrow cave. My breathing was heavy, the helmet fogged, and sweat ran into my eyes, burning them, but I could not wipe it away. "Alexei, status," Pavel's voice came through, steady as always, though I knew he was worried. He was alone inside, watching his instruments, knowing that if I failed to get back in, there was nothing he could do except report my death. "I am at the hatch, but it is too tight," I answered, fighting to keep my voice calm. "Adjust position. Enter feet first," he replied, though we both knew the design left no room for error. I looked down at the opening, the capsule glowing white in the sunlight, and rotated my body slowly. The stiffness of the suit made every movement deliberate. I managed to align my legs with the hatch, but when I tried to push in, the shoulders of the suit jammed against the rim. I pulled back, tried again, twisting slightly. No progress. The suit was still too rigid, the opening too narrow. "Blocked," I said, breathing hard. "I cannot enter in this position." Ground control joined the channel. Their voices were measured, controlled, but I could hear the concern beneath. "Cosmonaut Leonov, do not force. Attempt another orientation." I was floating above Earth, more than 400 kilometers high, and the only way home was through that small circle of metal. I thought for a moment, then made the decision that went against all the training. Feet first was the official method, but it was impossible now. I would have to go in head first, upside down. "Pavel, I am going head first," I said. There was a pause, a moment of silence as he absorbed it. Then, "It is risky. Your umbilical will twist. I have no choice. I am going in." I rotated my body again, slowly, awkwardly, until my helmet aligned with the hatch. The line attached to my waist twisted against me, pulling uncomfortably. I bent my arms as much as the suit allowed, grabbed the rim of the hatch, and began to push myself forward. My helmet scraped against the sides, the suit snagged on the edges, and I felt the tug of resistance with every centimeter. My chest was pounding now, not from fear but from the physical strain. "Alexei, report," ground control asked. "Attempting entry." "Progress is slow," I replied between breaths. Inside, Pavel guided me with short commands. "Tilt right. Push with your left arm. Watch the umbilical." His voice was firm, practical, the voice of a man who knew that panic was useless. I forced my shoulders through. The pressure against the edges made me feel like the suit would tear. My arms ached from the effort. For a moment, I was stuck halfway, neither outside nor inside, unable to move forward or back. The helmet pressed against the rim, squeezing tight. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. "Breathe steady," Pavel said quietly. "Do not waste air." I closed my eyes for a second, gathered what strength I had, and pushed harder. The suit gave slightly, enough for me to slide further. My chest entered, then my waist. The line twisted beneath me, but I kept pulling myself forward with short, sharp motions. Finally, my legs followed, and I fell headfirst into the capsule, colliding against the interior panels. "I am inside," I gasped. Pavel let out a short breath, the first sign of relief. "Good. Secure the hatch." I tried to turn myself around, but the suit was too stiff, the space too confined. I was upside down, floating awkwardly in the small cabin. My body was overheated, the sweat inside the suit had soaked my underclothing completely, and drops floated around inside the helmet like small globes of water. My vision blurred, and my hands trembled as I reached for the controls. "Ground, cosmonaut has re-entered. Hatch is closing," Pavel reported. His voice was professional again, but I could imagine the strain he felt during those minutes. The hatch sealed shut, and for the first time since stepping out, I felt a boundary between us and the void. But I did not feel relief. My body was in bad condition. My pulse was racing, my temperature too high, and the exertion had left me drained. The cabin was hot as well, and the ventilation struggled to clear the humidity. "Alexei, speak," ground control demanded. "I am inside." Suit pressure reduced. Physical condition, overstrained, I managed. I did not want to admit how exhausted I really was, but the truth was obvious in my voice. Pavel reached out and placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. It was the only gesture he could make in that cramped space, but it said enough. "Rest. I will handle the next sequence." I leaned back against the seat, letting the strap support me, trying to slow my breathing. My suit clung to me, soaked and heavy. My skin burned from the heat. I had made it back, but it had been at the edge of possibility. One more minute outside, one more mistake at the hatch, and the story would have ended differently. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the capsule, the faint hum of systems, the crackle of the radio, Pavel's steady voice reporting to Earth. I was back inside, but the flight was not over, and I knew we were only at the beginning of what would become an even greater struggle. The relief of closing the hatch lasted less than a minute. The air inside the capsule was hot and damp, and within moments both of us were sweating heavily. My undersuit was already soaked from the spacewalk, and now the cabin temperature rose further, the ventilation system unable to clear the humidity. Drops of moisture floated freely, sticking to instruments, drifting into our eyes and mouths. Breathing became uncomfortable, each inhale thick with heat. Pavel tried to wipe his visor with the back of his glove, but it only smeared the condensation. The flight had moved from one danger to another without pause. Ground, cabin temperature is high. Ventilation ineffective, Pavel reported. His voice was calm, but the words carried weight. The engineers on Earth answered quickly, but they had no instant fix. They suggested small adjustments to airflow and warned us not to remove our helmets yet. The fear was carbon dioxide building up before the system could circulate properly. I sat in my seat, helmet still sealed, and felt the heat pressing against my skin. The sweat inside the suit had no way out, pooling at my elbows and knees. I tried to flex my hands, but the gloves clung to me like wet rags. My heart was still racing from the spacewalk, and I knew that in this condition, overheating could quickly become as dangerous as vacuum outside. Pavel reached across the cramped space and tapped a gauge. CO2 rising slowly, he said. The words were measured, but the implication was clear: if the system failed to stabilize, we could suffocate. Alexei, how is your condition? Ground control asked. I swallowed, my throat dry despite the humidity. Fatigue severe. Body overheated. Suit soaked. But I remained conscious. The effort of speaking felt heavy, as though the air itself was resisting me. Pavel took charge of the controls. He was always composed, but now his movements were sharp, deliberate, as he adjusted valves and switches. He cracked open the oxygen flow slightly to push fresh gas into the cabin, but that carried the risk of raising pressure. We cannot continue like this, he muttered to me quietly, so ground would not hear the frustration. We both removed our helmets despite the orders, simply because there was no other option. The air inside hit my face like opening an oven door, thick and stifling, but at least I could wipe my forehead with the back of my hand. Drops of sweat flew off and floated between us. I laughed once, without humor. We are swimming in the air. Pavel ignored the joke. Focus. We still have to orient for reentry. That was the next problem. The automatic system responsible for aligning the capsule had failed. Without correct orientation, the retrorocket could not fire in the right direction, and we would remain in orbit until the air or power ran out. The ground confirmed the failure after several tense minutes. Voskhod 2, you must prepare for manual orientation. Commander Belayev, you will control attitude manually for reentry. Pavel acknowledged the order, but I could see in his eyes what he thought. Manual orientation had been tested in theory, but never in practice. The small periscope gave him only a limited view of Earth, and the capsule's controls were sluggish, like steering a heavy ship with tiny rudders. He would have to position us exactly, then fire the retrorocket at the correct moment, with no backup from the automatic system. The heat in the cabin was worsening. Our bodies were coated in sweat, and the humidity was so high that each breath felt like sucking water. The CO2 alarm began to buzz intermittently, a sharp reminder that time was against us. I tried to keep my mind clear, to focus on assisting Pavel with checklists, but my vision blurred and my head felt light. At one point I realized I had been drifting into a half-conscious state, staring at the wall without thought, until Pavel shook my arm. Stay with me, Alexei. We still have work to do. We prepared for the manual reentry. The ground gave us coordinates, the time to fire the rocket, and the expected burn duration. Pavel repeated each number aloud, and I wrote them on the pad with a pencil that barely gripped in my damp gloves. We rehearsed the sequence 3 times, checking instruments, aligning switches, repeating commands. The cabin smelled strongly of metal, plastic, and sweat. I wanted desperately to remove the suit entirely, but there was no time. Ground, Voskhod 2 is preparing for manual orientation, Pavel reported. His voice was controlled, but his face was pale under the helmet ring, and sweat dripped freely from his hair. I assisted by reading angles and confirming gauges while he turned the small hand controls, nudging the capsule to line up with Earth below. The periscope showed the planet drifting slowly across the view. He adjusted carefully, holding it steady against the natural rotation. Each correction required muscle, and he gritted his teeth with the effort. My own role was to monitor and remind him of timing. The seconds stretched as we watched the clock approach the designated burn moment. Orientation within margin, Pavel confirmed finally. His hand rested on the control for the retro-rocket. Ready to fire. Ground confirms. Proceed on mark, came the voice from Earth. The countdown began, my voice echoing inside the capsule. 10, 9, 8, my throat was dry, but the numbers came steady. 3, 2, 1, fire. Pavel pressed the switch. The retro-rocket engaged with a deep vibration that shook the capsule. For 60 seconds we felt the deceleration push us into our straps, the first solid force after hours of drifting. I watched the clock, calling out intervals, while he kept the ship aligned. The capsule rattled, and sweat shook free from my face, floating in the air. At last, the burn ended. Retrofire complete, Pavel said, his voice hoarse. The ground confirmed the trajectory. We were set for descent, but not without risks. Because of the manual orientation, there was no guarantee that the separation of modules would occur cleanly, and the reentry angle could still vary. If too shallow, we would skip off the atmosphere and remain in orbit until the next attempt. If too steep, we would burn. I looked at Pavel, and he looked back at me. No words were needed. We both understood that we had done everything possible, and now we had to wait for the Earth's atmosphere to decide our fate. The vibration of the retro-rocket had stopped, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. The capsule floated in darkness, waiting for the moment when the atmosphere would take hold of us. Both of us were strapped into our seats, our suits heavy with sweat, the cabin air hot and wet. I felt weak, as if all strength had been drained from my body, but I forced myself to remain focused. The separation of the equipment module was supposed to occur automatically, but we both knew that with so many systems already failing, nothing could be taken for granted. I kept my eyes fixed on the indicator, while Pavel gripped the manual controls. Seconds passed, then minutes, and still the light that should have shown separation did not come. Ground, separation signal not received, Pavel reported. His voice remained steady, but his jaw was tight. The reply took long seconds to arrive, distorted by static. Voskhod 2, telemetry confirms incomplete separation. Stand by. I turned my head slightly to look at Pavel. If it does not separate, we burn with the module attached. He nodded once. We wait. It may release under stress. There was nothing more to do. The capsule began to touch the upper layers of the atmosphere, and at once the vibration returned, this time from friction. The ship shook and groaned, metal expanding and contracting under the strain. I could feel the acceleration building, pushing me back into the seat. The module behind us still clung stubbornly, dragging at the capsule, twisting our orientation. Through the periscope, I saw flashes of fire as plasma began to form outside. The sky turned from black to a deep orange glow. The radio filled with static, voices from the ground breaking into fragments. Then the blackout arrived, complete silence. We were alone. The forces grew stronger. My chest compressed, my limbs heavy. The suit pressed into me like a second skin. I tried to raise my arm to check an indicator but could not. My vision narrowed. The capsule shook violently, and I heard a sharp crack as something tore outside. For a moment, I thought the hull had failed, but then Pavel shouted over the noise, separation. The module had finally broken away under the stress of re-entry. The capsule lurched, then steadied, aligning properly. Flames still roared outside, visible through the periscope, but at least we were falling as designed. The G-forces mounted, 6 times my body weight, then more. My breathing turned into grunts with each attempt to inhale. Sweat streamed into my eyes, and my head felt like it would burst. I forced myself to speak, though my voice came out as a strained whisper. "Pavel, are you conscious?" "Conscious," he answered, though the word was barely audible. We both knew that loss of consciousness here meant death. Neither of us could afford to black out before parachutes deployed. I tried to focus on one thing only, counting the seconds, reminding myself that every second survived was one step closer to the ground. My body was screaming to let go, to close my eyes, but I clenched my teeth and repeated numbers silently. The blackout continued, silence in the radio, only the howl of reentry filling the cabin. Then, suddenly, the noise decreased, the pressure eased, and my chest expanded again. I gasped deeply, the first full breath in minutes, as the capsule slowed. The periscope showed blue sky now, clouds beneath us. We waited for the parachute system to engage. Pavel held the switch for manual backup, ready in case it failed. The seconds dragged until finally there was a violent jolt, and the capsule shook as the main parachute deployed. The descent slowed, the straps bit into my shoulders, and the sound of air rushing past filled the cabin. I looked at Pavel, and for the first time since the spacewalk, he allowed himself a small smile. "We are not dead yet," he said quietly. I laughed, though it came out more like a cough. "Not yet." But our ordeal was far from finished. The capsule continued to fall through thick clouds, the view of the ground hidden. We had expected to land on open steppe, where recovery forces would already be waiting. Instead, the altimeter ticked down rapidly, and when the clouds broke, we saw not flat plains but endless forest beneath us, dark and dense, with no clearings in sight. "Ground, we are over forest. No open landing zone visible," Pavel reported. There was no answer yet. The blackout and poor radio coverage meant we were effectively on our own. The final impact came suddenly, a heavy crash that threw both of us forward against the straps. The capsule hit hard, bounced once, then rolled down through trees, branches scraping and breaking around us. Finally it stopped at an angle, wedged among trunks, half buried in snow. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I listened only to the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Pavel unstrapped first and pushed against the side. "We are down. Alive." I forced my body free of the straps. Every muscle trembled, my clothes still drenched, the air in the capsule thick and cold now. I looked through the small porthole. Snow-covered trees surrounded us on all sides. The sun was already dipping low, and shadows stretched across the forest. There were no helicopters, no vehicles, no sign of recovery forces. Only silence. "We are far off course," I said. "Yes," Pavel agreed. He reached for the radio, but the signal was weak. Only fragments of words reached us. No coordinates, no instructions. We were alone in the Siberian wilderness, with night approaching and wolves somewhere in those forests. I leaned back in my seat, exhausted beyond measure. We had survived the suit, the heat, the manual reentry, the blackout, and the landing, but now another challenge awaited. As I looked at Pavel in the dim light of the cabin, he gave me a tired smile. "We will spend the night here, Alexei. Tomorrow they will find us." I nodded, but in my mind I wondered how long it would really take, and whether our strength would hold until then. The silence after landing was not peaceful. It was the silence of being stranded, of knowing that the entire mission had been thrown off course and that no one had any precise idea where we were. The forest pressed against the capsule from all sides, snow drifted against the hull, and the only sound was the creaking of branches under their own weight. The air inside was damp and cold, our suits heavy with moisture, and every movement felt sluggish after the exhaustion of the previous hours. Pavel tried the radio again, but only fragments of distorted voices came back, never a full sentence, never coordinates. We were alive, but we were isolated, and the sun was already sinking below the trees. "Alexei, open your helmet," Pavel said. I obeyed without hesitation, and the cold air of the forest hit my face. It was sharp and raw, a shock after the stifling heat inside the capsule. I breathed deeply, and for the first time since the spacewalk I felt real air against my lungs, but the relief quickly turned to concern. The temperature was falling fast, and night in Siberia at this time of year was brutal. Our suits were soaked through, we had no dry clothing, no food, and only limited water. The engineers had not designed the Voskhod for survival in the taiga. We debated whether to stay inside the capsule or try to set up some kind of shelter outside. The capsule was cramped and damp, but it offered at least a metal shell against the wind. Outside, the snow was deep, the ground uneven, and wolves were a real possibility. In the end we decided to remain inside. Pavel used the small onboard heater, but it barely made a difference. The metal walls radiated cold. We curled into our seats, trying to conserve warmth. My legs cramped badly, but I had no strength to stretch them. I closed my eyes, listening to every sound in the forest, half expecting claws to scrape against the hull. "Do you think they know where we are?" I asked finally. "They know we are down," Pavel answered. "But finding us will take time. The forest is wide. We may wait days." It was not comforting, but it was the truth. I nodded, too tired to respond further. The night was long. Sleep came in short, shallow moments, interrupted by shivers that shook my whole body. At one point I woke to a faint howl in the distance. It was not imagination, the wolves were real, circling somewhere in the trees. I did not mention it to Pavel, but from the look in his eyes I knew he had heard them too. We sat in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. I wondered if this was how it would end, two cosmonauts surviving the vacuum of space only to freeze or be taken by animals in the taiga. At dawn, the light filtered through the porthole, pale and blue. We were stiff, weak, but alive. Pavel tried the radio again, and this time the connection was stronger. We managed to pass a partial signal, enough for ground to confirm that they had located our general area. Helicopters would come, but the terrain was too dense for them to land. Recovery forces would have to ski in. That meant at least another night in the forest. During the day, we decided to leave the capsule briefly to stretch our bodies. We opened the hatch, and the cold air rushed in fully. The snow was knee-deep, the trees tall and close together. We stumbled out in our damp suits, sinking into the snow, our boots soaking immediately. We walked a short circle around the capsule, both to keep our circulation moving and to scout the surroundings. The forest seemed endless, only trees and snow in every direction. After a short while we returned inside, teeth chattering. The capsule, for all its discomfort, was still better than exposure outside. The second night was harder than the first. Our strength was lower, and the temperature dropped further. We wrapped ourselves in what insulation we could find, but it was minimal. I lay awake for hours, staring at the dim walls, thinking of the last days, the suit, the heat, the reentry, the landing. Each stage had been a narrow escape, and yet here we were, still not finished with the ordeal. On the morning of the third day, the sound of engines broke the silence. Helicopters circled overhead, but as expected, they could not land. Soon after, we heard the voices of rescuers calling through the trees. A team on skis arrived, dressed in heavy winter gear, carrying supplies and weapons for the wolves. The relief of seeing them was indescribable, but my body was too drained to express it. I simply nodded as they pulled open the hatch and handed us hot tea. The warmth of that liquid was more powerful than any celebration. We could not leave immediately. The terrain made it impossible to extract the capsule by air at once. The rescuers set up a small camp nearby, building a fire and preparing food. For the first time since orbit, I ate properly, though my stomach resisted after the stress. That night we slept in a tent with the rescuers, the fire keeping the worst of the cold away. It felt like a return to normal life, though the forest around us reminded me constantly of how close we had come to not surviving. Finally, after another day of waiting, the weather allowed for extraction. We were taken out by helicopter, flown back over the endless forest that had held us captive, and delivered to safety. Officials greeted us with smiles, engineers asked for reports, and photographers tried to capture the image of triumph. But for me, triumph was not the word. What I carried from that mission was not glory but the memory of sweat filling my helmet, of forcing my body through the hatch, of the crushing weight during reentry, and of the long cold nights among the trees. When people later asked what it felt like to be the first man to walk in space, I always told them the truth. The beauty of Earth from above is unforgettable, but what I remember most is how fragile survival is. A suit a little too stiff, a cabin a little too hot, a system a little too late, any one of those things could have been the end. We survived because we refused to give up at each step, because Pavel stayed calm, and because luck did not turn completely against us. That is the real story of Voskhod 2. Even now, years later, when I close my eyes I can still hear Pavel's voice in the capsule, "Stay with me, Alexei. We still have work to do." And I remember that in space, and on Earth, survival is always work, hard, exhausting, but worth every breath.